There is a couple at Eleanor's diner in Ashford who have sat on the same side of the same booth for 50 years. And I want to ask you a question about them before we begin, because the question is the whole story. Not across from each other, the way couples sit, side by side, on one bench, both facing out into the room, with the whole opposite side of the booth left empty in front of them. Every week, the same corner booth, the same arrangement, for 50 years. And for 50 years, the town has looked at that and smiled and thought the obvious thing. Isn't that sweet? Still lovebirds after all this time, and gone back to its coffee. But here is the question. Why? Why would two people, married half a century, choose every single week to crowd onto one side of a booth and leave the other side empty? What exactly are they doing? Because a couple does not keep a ritual that precise, that unbroken for 50 years for no reason. They were protecting something, and nobody in Ashford ever thought to ask what. Let me set it in front of you exactly as the diner sees it, because the picture matters. The corner booth at Eleanor's, the good one by the window. Ada on the inside against the wall, Vernon beside her on her right, the two of them shoulder to shoulder on the one bench, and across the table the empty seat, week after week, year after year. They are in their 80s now. They come in the same mornings, order much the same things, stay much the same length of time, and they sit always the same way, together on one side, the world in front of them, the other bench bare. It is the kind of small standing fact that a town stops seeing precisely because it never changes. The Corliss couple and their booth, sweet old pair. And the smile the town gives them is a real and kind smile. And it is also a way of not looking, because sweet is a lid you put on a thing so you don't have to open it. This channel has a weakness for exactly the lids that towns put on things. And a ritual repeated 50,000 times is the most tempting lid there is. Because a ritual is not a habit. A habit is loose, you keep it when it's convenient and drop it when it isn't. A ritual is exact and defended and kept even when it costs you. And that exactness is always a sentence, being said over and over by people who may not even know anymore that they're saying it. Ada and Vernon Corliss had been saying the same sentence with their bodies every week for 50 years in a booth at Eleanor's in plain sight of a whole town. Nobody had read it. So let's read it. Start with the booth itself, because the booth has its own 50-year journey, and it tells you how deep the ritual runs. That corner booth is older than most of the people who sit in it now. It has been recovered. Eleanor's mother ran the diner before Eleanor, and the leather has been redone at least twice that anyone remembers, the colour changing from red to a kind of brown to the oxblood it is now. The diner has changed hands, changed its menu, changed nearly everything about itself across 50 years. There was a stretch in the middle when the whole place was nearly sold and gutted, and a stretch after that when new owners tore out half the booths for tables, and through all of it the corner booth stayed, partly because Eleanor's mother made keeping it a condition, and no one afterward had the heart to undo it. The one thing that has not changed is that the corner booth is the Corliss's, and everyone knows it, and on the mornings they're expected, it is quietly kept for them, And if a stranger happens to be sitting there when they arrive, Eleanor has a gentle way of relocating them that the stranger never quite notices. 50 years of a town rearranging itself in tiny ways around one couple's booth. And not one person doing the rearranging had ever asked why the booth mattered so much. They just knew that it did. Let me give you one ordinary morning, because it was one ordinary morning that finally cracked the thing open for me, and it will show you what 50 years of townsfolk had looked straight through. A family of strangers had come in, passing through Ashford, and taken the table nearest the corner booth, and their youngest, a boy of perhaps 6, no malice in him, only the flat, honest curiosity of the young, had noticed Vernon's face and his shaking hand, and had stared, the way children do, and then said something to his mother, not quietly enough. And the mother had shushed him and coloured and pointedly not looked, which is worse than looking. And for a moment, the small cruelty of the world was gathered right there at the edge of the Corliss's booth. And I watched Ada handle it. She did not glare at the family. She did not stiffen or shrink. She simply leaned in toward Vernon, said something that made him do the slow, lopsided thing that was his laugh, and in the same motion turned her shoulder a few more degrees into the room. And just like that, the family's sightline closed, and Vernon was behind the wall, laughing with his wife, and the moment passed as if it had never been. It took perhaps 4 seconds. It was the most practiced thing I have ever seen anyone do. And that was when I understood that I was not watching a sweet habit. I was watching a skill honed over decades, and a skill that specific only exists because there is something it was built to do. Now watch Ada, because Ada is the one to watch. Though the town has always watched Vernon. Vernon was the talker, the character, the one people remember from before. Ada sits, always, in the same spot, on the inside, against the wall, with Vernon on her right. Always his right. Never once in 50 years the other way around. And she sits close, closer than the bench requires, closer than a couple who've been married 50 years generally bother to sit, because by 50 years most couples have earned a little space. And she sits angled, not squared to Vernon, not squared to the table, but turned very slightly outward toward the room, so that her shoulder is the first thing the room meets when it looks toward their booth. Romance is loose and comfortable. It sprawls. This was not loose. This was exact, and it was the same exact every week for decades. Something was being managed. You just had to be willing to see a fortress where the town had agreed to see a cuddle. Watch a little longer, and the rest of the choreography comes clear. Ada orders, always, for both of them, smoothly. Before the waitress has quite finished arriving, Vernon will have the eggs, and tea for us both, thank you, love, so that the exchange with the stranger is hers, handled, done, and Vernon never has to conduct it. When someone at another table lets their gaze drift over and linger a half-second too long toward the corner booth, Ada has a way of shifting, a small movement, a laugh, a reach for the sugar that draws the eye to herself and off the man beside her, the way you'd move to put yourself between a bright light and someone trying to rest. None of it is fussy. None of it looks like anything. That is the genius of it. For 50 years, Ada Corliss has been running a quiet, seamless, invisible operation in that booth, and the whole point of the operation was that no one would ever see it was happening. including, very nearly, this channel. So here is what Ada was angled to keep between her shoulder and the room. About 30 years ago, 20 years into the marriage, when they were still, by the standards of this story, young, Vernon had a stroke. He survived it and recovered a great deal, and went on to have 30 more years of life, which is the good news and not the point. The point is what it left. It left the left side of his face slack, the mouth pulled down, the eye not quite keeping up with the other one. It left his left hand unreliable, a tremor and a weakness that made a fork a small daily negotiation. And it left his speech slowed and thickened, the words all still in there, all still his, but coming out on a delay and with a slur that strangers, God forgive them, hear as something other than the sharp and funny man Vernon Corliss had been his whole life, and underneath still was. You have to understand who Vernon had been to understand what the stroke took that was not physical. He had been the talker, the one who held the table, who had the joke, who could not walk the length of the Ashford Square without 3 conversations breaking out. His voice and his face had been his whole way of being in the world, and a stroke took a man like that and left him, in his own estimation, in the cruel mathematics of a proud man, diminished, on display, an object of the particular pity that makes a person want to eat every meal at home behind a closed door for the rest of his life. Because that is what nearly happened. In the months after the stroke, Vernon stopped wanting to go out. He could not bear the flit of a stranger's eyes to his slack cheek and away, the too bright kindness of a waitress speaking to him slowly, the whole small daily humiliation of being seen struggling with a world that used to be effortless. He began quietly to shrink his life down to the size of the house, and a man who does that does not usually come back out. The house closes over him, and the town, which forgets a face fast, files him under "we don't see him anymore." And that is the end of a man's public life, and often the beginning of the end of the man. There must have been a first morning, the first time they went back to Eleanor's after the stroke, and though I did not see it, I have thought about it often, because everything else grew out of it. Picture Vernon not wanting to go, and Ada getting him there anyway, and the two of them at the door of the diner with the whole room to cross, and Vernon's certainty that every eye would land on him, and every one of them would carry that flinch. And picture Ada, in the half-second before they walked in, making a decision she never announced and never explained, that she would simply take the seat on his bad side and put herself between him and all of it. She could not fix his face. She could not steady his hand or unslur his words or give him back the effortless man he'd been. Those were beyond her. But she could control exactly one thing in that entire diner, where she chose to place her own body. And she took that one thing, the only lever she had, and she pulled it. That first morning and every morning after for 30 years. It is a very small power, the power to decide where you sit. Ada Corliss turned it into a shield big enough to keep a man's whole dignity alive. What Ada did about it, she did without a single word of discussion, and she did it by changing where they sat. That was all. She simply began, from the first time they went back to Eleanor's after the stroke, to sit on the same side as Vernon, on his left, always his left, the struck side. with her shoulder turned to the room. And in doing that, she built him a wall. From the room's point of view, the corner booth now showed Ada, Ada's face, Ada's shoulder, Ada ordering, Ada laughing, Ada being the one the room's eyes landed on. And behind that wall, sheltered out of the sight line, Vernon could eat his eggs with a hand that shook and a face that drooped and a slur in his voice. In public, like any man, in perfect peace, because the only person who could see him clearly was the one person who had stopped seeing the stroke 30 years before it happened. She did not take him home to protect him. She took him out and made herself the thing the world looked at, so that he never had to be. And now the sweet old couple, the lovebirds still crowded onto one side of the booth after 50 years, turns over into something that is not sweet at all, or rather is sweet the way tempered steel is sweet. The town had the love right and the softness completely wrong. This was not a postcard. This was a fierce, exact 30-year campaign waged every single week with the only weapon Ada had, which was the choice of where to put her own body. She took the harder seat, the wall side, the struck side, the outward angle, 10,000 times, so that the man she loved could keep his dignity in a public room. There is nothing soft about that. It is one of the hardest, steadiest things a person can do, and she did it in a way specifically designed to make sure that neither Vernon nor the town would ever quite catch her doing it, because to be caught would have named the thing she was hiding, and naming it would have hurt him. And hurting him was the one outcome the whole operation existed to prevent. We are trained to imagine great love as something that announces itself, the gesture, the speech, the thing you can photograph. This was the opposite kind, and I have come to think it is the higher kind, a love so entirely for the other person that it worked hardest to be invisible, that measured its success by how completely it went unseen. The best thing Ada ever did for Vernon is a thing almost no one ever witnessed. That is not a flaw in the story, that is the story. There is a second layer to it, though, and it is the layer that makes me love the story rather than only admire it. And you find it by asking a question the reveal almost lets you skip. The stroke was 30 years ago, but the ritual, the same side of the booth, is 50 years old. They have sat that way since before the stroke, since the very beginning, since they were courting and newly married, and had every reason to sit across from each other and gaze, and chose instead to squeeze onto one bench so they could be close. The same side habit did not start as armor. It started as young love, as two people who simply could not bear the width of a table between them. And then, 20 years in, the world changed, and the very same gesture, without anyone deciding it, quietly became something else. The closeness became a shield. The thing they'd done because they were in love became the thing that let one of them keep his dignity. That is the journey of it. One bench, one gesture, 50 years. And across those years, it turned from romance into protection, without ever once looking any different from the outside. The town watched the same picture for half a century and never knew it was watching the meaning change. I find that almost unbearably beautiful, and I want to make sure you feel why. Most gestures mean one thing. This one meant two, in sequence, across a lifetime, and the seam between the two meanings is invisible even to the people who lived it. There was no morning when Ada sat down and thought, today the closeness becomes armor. It simply happened. the way a riverbed deepens, and the same water, the same channel, cutting slowly into something else. The young woman who squeezed onto one bench because a table's width from her husband was more than she could stand, and the old woman who takes that same bench to build a wall between her husband and a careless world, are the same woman doing the same thing, and the thing has quietly become its opposite and its fulfillment at once. That is what 50 years does to a gesture, if the love behind it holds. It doesn't replace the first meaning with the second. It lets the second grow up inside the first, so that when Ada sits down now, she is doing both at the same time, being close to him and shielding him, and could not, if you asked her, tell you where the one ends and the other begins. There's a detail most people miss about a marriage, the long kind, the 50-year kind, and Ada's booth side is the whole of it made visible. We think a marriage is made of the big things, the vows, the crises survived, the grand declarations. But the vows take a minute to say, and the crises are rare, and neither one is where a marriage actually lives. A marriage is made of the small loyalties, the ones repeated 10,000 times when no one is watching and no one will ever thank you. The harder seat taken without comment, the order placed so the other doesn't have to speak, the shoulder turned to the room week after week after week for 30 years. That is not the backdrop to the marriage. That is the marriage. Ada Corliss did not love Vernon in a grand way. She loved him in the small, exact, relentless way that actually holds two people together across a lifetime. And she did it so quietly and so well that even the object of it might not have known the full shape of what she did. And here is what ought to stop you if you have ever been tempted to think the great romances are the loud ones. Ada never once, in 30 years, got to be thanked for the thing she did best, because the thing she did best only worked if it stayed invisible. The moment anyone named it, the moment someone said out loud, "Look how she shields him," it would have become a spotlight instead of a shield, and would have done to Vernon precisely what she was spending herself to prevent. So she was locked, by the very nature of her love, into a loyalty she could never be seen performing, never be praised for, never even fully acknowledged to the man it was for. Most of us could not sustain a kindness for a week without some flicker of credit. Ada sustained hers for 3 decades on no credit at all, on purpose, because credit would have ruined it. There is a name for love that gives everything and requires that no one ever notice. It is not a common name because it is not a common love. Though I think Vernon knew, that is the tender part I can't prove and choose to believe anyway. A man does not spend 30 years across the breakfast from a woman turning her shoulder to the room without somewhere understanding what she is doing, even if it was never said, even if to say it would have broken the spell that made it bearable. I think Vernon Corliss ate 30 years of eggs behind the wall of his wife's shoulder and knew every single morning exactly what that shoulder was for, and let her think he didn't, because letting her protect him was its own way of loving her back. That is the thing about the deepest loyalties. They often run in both directions at once and get called by only one name. She protected his dignity by shielding him. He protected hers by letting her and never making her say it. There is a kind of couple, and you will have known one, who seem to have worked out a language beneath language, who conduct whole conversations in the set of a shoulder and the passing of a cup, who have been married so long that the words have mostly become unnecessary. Ada and Vernon were that couple, and the same side booth was the great sentence of that wordless language, spoken and answered every week for decades. She said, with where she sat, "I have got you. You are safe. No one is looking." He said, by settling in behind her without protest, by having his coffee and his slow, lopsided jokes, "I know, and I let you, and that is how I love you back." 50 years of a marriage and 30 years of a shield, carried on almost entirely without a word spoken about the thing itself. The town heard silence and saw a quiet old couple. It was not silence. It was the most fluent conversation in Ashford. Eleanor, for what it's worth, always knew. She had to. You cannot keep a booth for a couple for decades and seat them just so and relocate the strangers gently and not understand what you're a part of. Eleanor never said a word either. She simply kept the corner booth and brought the check to Ada's side of the table without being asked, and made sure the light from the window fell the right way, and learned which of the passing strangers to seat with their backs to the corner and which it didn't matter about, and played her own small silent part in the fortress, one of the quiet accomplices every act of long love turns out to have, if you look. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, that Ada's 30-year kindness was itself held up by other, smaller kindnesses, by an Eleanor who chose, year after year, to notice and to help and to say nothing. There is a whole architecture of people, it turns out, holding up one old couple's ordinary breakfast, a diner owner, a kept booth, a town that rearranged itself without knowing why, and every one of them keeping the same tender secret, which is that it was never ordinary at all. That is how the good things get carried in a place like Ashford, not by one grand hand, but by a dozen quiet ones that never take the credit and never compare notes. I want to be careful how I leave Vernon, because this is not a sad story, and he is not a sad figure, and to pity him would be to do the exact thing Ada spent 30 years making sure the room never did. Vernon Corliss got to be an old man in his town, out in the world, at his booth, with his wife, having his coffee like anyone. Got to keep the public life a stroke tried to take from him, because someone loved him enough to build him a way to keep it. That is not a diminished life. That is a life defended, inch by inch, by the person best placed to defend it, and lived fully inside the defense. He was not hidden. He was held. There is all the difference in the world between the two, and the difference was Ada and where she chose to sit. So I'm going to leave you with the question this one opens rather than close it off, because it's the kind that ought to stay open. You walk past couples like the Corlisses all the time. Every diner has one, every town, maybe your own family has one. The sweet old pair you smile at and file away without a second look. How many of them are fortresses? How much fierce, exact, invisible engineering is going on in plain sight in the couples and the families you pass every day, dismissed with a fond glance because you've agreed in advance that there's nothing there to see? The whole lesson of this booth, if it has one, is that sweet, is very often a wall we build so we don't have to see how hard someone is working, and that the tenderest things in a town are usually the ones hiding behind the words we use to wave them away. And closer than that, closer to home, what is the small, steady, unremarked thing that someone in your own life does for you, so quietly and so consistently that you have almost stopped noticing it? The harder seat they always take, the call they always make first, the subject they always steer away from because they know it costs you, the thing they always handle so you don't have to. Most of us have an Ada somewhere, someone turning their shoulder to the room on our behalf, year after year, and asking nothing and being thanked for none of it because we never even see it happening. And most of us are an Ada to someone too. In some small way, we've stopped counting. Those quiet, uncredited loyalties are not the decoration on a life. They are the load-bearing walls of it. And it might be worth it, sometime this week, to look up from your own booth and try to catch one of them in the act, the one being done for you or the one you're doing, and let yourself feel, just for a second, the full weight of a thing that was built to never be noticed. The corner booth is still there at Eleanor's, and on the mornings they're expected, it's still kept empty until they come. Ada still takes the inside, the wall, the left, the harder seat, her shoulder to the room, the way she has 10,000 times. And tomorrow there is another Ashford secret waiting to be opened, a bigger and older one, kept behind a hidden door under a buried key for 40 years, the last of the 3 keys, and the thing it has been guarding all this time. We're going to find out together. We'll come back.